morning, everyone.
Hey, great. Okay, thank you. Hello.
Buenos dias. I could do this talk in Spanish, but I don't think the translators would have an easy time translating the Portuñol to all of you. So I'm going to stick to English. So the title of this talk is Money. Can we put the presentation on? Let's see. There you go. So the title of this talk is Money, Past, Present, and Future. But before we jump into the presentation itself, let me share with you guys Crypto Voices, which is a great podcast in which I'm a co-host along with my friend, my buddy Matt Mezinskis. I think he's in the audience, or perhaps he's running late. There you are? Very well. He actually blackmailed and threatened me to kick me out of the show if I didn't put this in the presentation. So there you go. But so the topic of today, the monetary system. I want to talk not just about Bitcoin itself, but also explain and highlight some of the features or bugs of the current monetary system and how Bitcoin can play a fundamental role in the future of this monetary system. So right now, when we take a look at the system, what we live on, or we live under, is the dollar standard. So this is the current monetary regime. All paper currencies, they revolve around the dollar, and the dollar is the monetary unit of account of the whole world. Everything is priced in dollars, and this is the standard. But the irony is the dollar itself, the paper dollar, it isn't redeemable in anything. It is an IOU. It's a liability issued by the Federal Reserve System, which cannot be converted into anything. It's not backed by gold or silver, anything. It's redeemed in itself only, which is a complete and utter anomaly in the current financial system. And if you ask the average person nowadays, what is the dollar? The typical answer would be this. Well, it's the George Washington Federal Reserve note, the $1 bill. This is the typical answer. But as a matter of fact, the word dollar is much older than these notes. The word dollar, if we read the documents, the founding documents of the United States, we can see the word dollar in the Articles of Confederation, in the US Constitution, as depicted here in this slide. We can see on section 9, where tax was already priced in dollars, and also on section 10, where it said, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coins, legal tender, in payments and debts. This is what they meant. But back then, this is 1787, there was no legal definition yet for the word dollar. It didn't define, the US Constitution, nor did the Bill of Rights define what a dollar was. And it didn't have to for usual practice of commerce, because everybody knew what a dollar meant, and it meant the Spanish silver dollar, a silver coin that was actually minted for the first time in the 16th century. And the dollar, this is just a picture of the Spanish dollar. This was the most widely circulated coin during colonial America. So, and this was actually the monetary unit back then. And it wasn't because of any decree of government, nor because the King of England said that the citizens of the US had to use this. It was just the market usual practice. It was adopted by the market. And the name dollar actually comes from thaler, which is an abbreviation of Joachimsthaler, which was a silver coin minted by the Count of Schlick in Joachimstown, the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, back in the 16th century. But it was up to the Coinage Act of 1792 to actually define the dollar. So when we speak of the constitutional dollar, the legal dollar, this is the definition as given by this act, which was signed by the then President George Washington. And this act not only established the mint in the United States, but also regulated coins, and said specifically, dollars or units each to be of the value of the Spanish $1 as the same is now current. It was already the currency of the States, of the United States, and to contain 371.25 grains of pure silver. So this is the legal definition of dollar. This is what a dollar actually means according to the United States Constitution. And in this act, it also defined the money of account to be expressed in dollars or units. But there was one problem with this act and all the acts soon after this one, because this was the first precedent for bimetallism or bimetallic standard, because in this act, they also defined the value of gold in terms of silver. So they defined a fixed ratio for gold to silver 15 to 1. And what this meant was the price of the two currencies should be fixed. But as you know, any commodity, the price fluctuates according to supply, according to demand. And when we fix the two monies, the two metals, one against the other, you eventually end up overvaluing one against the other. And it happened in many instances in the 18th, and the 17th, and the 19th century, through many acts where in one period of time the gold would just flow out of the country, disappear from the market, or the silver. And just a brief overview of some of the legal monetary acts or history of the United States. We had the Legal Tender Act in 1862, where Abraham Lincoln issued the famous greenbacks, so paper dollars inconvertible into anything. And then all the other acts, and which end up culminated in the 1913 Federal Reserve System. Now, what is important to note here is that from the 1870s until 1914, when the Federal Reserve actually started operations, the United States was living under a so-called classical gold standard. So silver coins and gold coins, they were used in the market, and the paper issued, either silver certificates or gold certificates or even Federal Reserve notes, they were redeemed in specie. Citizens could redeem and could ask for redemption. But after that, and then the 1933 executive order by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in 1933, Executive Order 6102, when gold ownership was prohibited in the United States and everyone had to give up their gold and surrender their gold to the United States government. After this classical gold standard was no longer in place. And then we had the Bretton Woods system that set the monetary order in terms of the dollar. It was still anchored in gold, but the pillar of the system was the Federal Reserve dollar, the United States dollar. So every other currency would peg or be somehow fixed to the US dollar, and the US dollar would redeem dollars into the fixed ratio of $35 per troy ounce. That was the crux of the Federal Reserve, the Bretton Woods system. So this meant the United States had an obligation to redeem dollars at this fixed ratio. But of course, if you have a situation, a scenario where every nation is accepting your currency, your IOUs, as if it were gold, why would you bother with this parity? You can just issue more IOUs and the nations and every other government will keep accepting your money. There's no reason to bother with this, with the redemption of the gold itself. But of course, when you start flooding the market, and this is something that then President, this was the 1960s here on the left corner here, then President General Charles de Gaulle, he denounced this system and he used the term the exorbitant privilege. He didn't coin this term, but he used it very often. The exorbitant privilege of the US dollar, because this meant every nation was accepting dollars as good as gold. But of course, as dollars were being flooded into the market and nations realized this parity would no longer be able to be maintained, the United States saw its monetary gold stock being depleted year after year. So this is the inception of Bretton Woods, 1944, up to 1971, when Richard Nixon finally closed the gold window, ending this monetary era where we still had an anchor, an attachment to gold, and dollars could be finally settled and redeemed in gold. And this is the era we live now. This announcement by President Nixon on 15th of August 1971 ushered a new era of inconvertible paper currencies. So there's nothing backing, there's nothing being actually redeemed in these dollars that we currently use. And this is Jerome Powell, the current Federal Reserve President. So if George Washington were alive today and you told him, this is what people think a dollar is, I guess this would be his reaction. And it's ironic because when we talk about fraud, and there's a lot of fraud prevention rules, treatises, mechanisms, but there's no greater fraud than our current monetary system. I mean, it's irredeemable in nothing but the liabilities issued by the central banks themselves. So this means our current monetary system, the monetary regime, is completely debt-based. I'm sure you all know this, but it's not only debt-based, it's even worse because it's unpayable debt. No single paper currency is actually paid in anything. They're never finally settled. And this leads to severe imbalances in international payments. I'm sure you heard the phrase balance of payments differences. That since the era of the end of Bretton Woods, no balance of payments differences are settled. Before that, whenever a country paid more abroad than it received from abroad, gold would flow out of the country. And when the inverse happened, when it received more from abroad, gold would flow into the country. So this was a kind of automatic adjustment mechanism that the classical gold standard, and even during the Bretton Woods system, we had. But since then, there's no mechanism. So these imbalances, the balance of payment differences, they're never settled. And the imbalances, they keep growing and keep building up. This is the chart, it's a flow chart with the annual net lending or net borrowing from the rest of the world to the United States. So you can see this is, since the 1970s, the imbalances began to build up. And this is the net lending, the rest of the world lending to the US. Or the inverse of this chart, the federal government being a net borrower year after year. And the end result is what we call the US net international investment position. This is the US as a nation. So this is a private and the public sector. This means all the assets accumulated over the years minus liabilities. And this comes to a negative, so more liabilities in the order of magnitude of $8 trillion. That's the US international investment position. And this is only made possible because of the current monetary order of inconvertible paper dollars. That's what happens. Now, when we speak of the gold standard, perhaps one of the greatest merits of gold, and it's something that people often talk about, is how it is an inflation protection, a hedge against inflation. And I'm sure this is one of the most important, and I do agree with this, but it's not the only one. One of the other reasons for gold is because it was the final settlements asset and also as a way to manage liquidity between banks. Not just between commercial banks, but also between nations and between central banks. And since we went off the gold standard, there's no other mechanism to settle debts between countries. So there's no final debt liquidation. We just keep piling more and more debt year after year. But of course, even though we have, this is the current state of affairs, a irredeemable paper dollar, governments around the world, they do not trust each other that much. And that's why every single developed nation, and here I have the vault of the Bank of England, they still hold enormous amounts of gold. And why? Because gold is nobody else's liability. I mean, it's an asset in the truest sense of the word. It has no default risk, so it's nobody else's liability. And it's the final crisis hedge. They know if something happens in the world, if paper dollar starts being hyperinflated, they know that gold will be accepted. So this is why gold is still used and still held by governments and central banks around the world. So would I be advocating for a return of the gold standard? No, I don't think it would work nowadays. And not because of economic reasons, because this is actually how most of economists, they denounce gold, the gold standard, as a terrible monetary system because it would bring about price deflation. I think this is one of the greatest parts about the gold standard. So this is not the problem itself. The problem why it is infeasible today is just because of purely technological and logistical costs. I mean, if you just imagine the huge amount of cost to move gold around, the risks involved, the insurance, just to give you an idea of how this works, this is the British ship HMS Lawrence. It sank off the British coast in 1917, carrying 44 tons of gold. Most of it was recovered years after. Now imagine all this gold, just the cost involved to move, priced to today, this 40 tons of gold would be around 1.8 billion US dollars. So just imagine the amount of cost and risks involved to move gold out of the vaults, loading into the ship, and then moving it, sailing across the Pacific or across the Atlantic, and then having on the other side, unloading the ship and moving into the vault, and also certifying that all the bars are genuine. I mean, we do have another system that's much easier and much cheaper than this, and it's called Bitcoin. So this is the reason for me that one of the reasons why I think Bitcoin is destined to play a fundamental role in the future of money. And I see as mainly two reasons. One, as a new final asset for international settlement. So a new ultimate asset. It is contending to dethrone gold as this reserve asset, as a safe haven asset. It's not there yet. It has the potential, but it's not there yet. For Bitcoin to be perceived as immutable as gold, as a safe haven asset, it must be developed and tested, and we are still years, perhaps decades away from this happening. But it has this potential. But of course, it won't happen if we hard fork the hell out of it every 6 months. Now, the second reason is because it's also a platform, a neutral, open, and uncensorable platform where this international transfer, the international settlements can happen. Now, this feature of being an international, uncensorable global payment or settlement system is already being a concern by many leaders around the world, and here I bring two prominent figures like Heiko Maas on the left. He's the foreign minister of Germany who in August published an op-ed in the Handelsblatt newspaper where he advocated for a new SWIFT payment system, free from US pressure, free from US influence. And just last week we had Vladimir Putin said that Russia doesn't have a clear objective to move away from the dollar. It's actually the dollar that is moving away from us. That was his words last week. So there is a role, even in the current international state of affairs, for Bitcoin to be played. Now, when we talk about the future of money, and when we see central bankers and economists talking about the future of money, usually what they talk about is a cashless society, a cashless world. I mean, I do see Bitcoin as a clear geopolitical weapon for governments to use right now, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But when these guys, central bankers and politicians and bureaucrats, when they talk about the future of money, they mean a cashless world. So this means even everyone voluntarily just surrender paper money and start using completely digital forms of money, or even it's prohibited. As some economists are even fostering this idea of outright prohibition of paper money. Now, when they do this, what they want to introduce now is what they call a central bank digital currency, CBDC. And they say that a central bank digital currency would give us a global money that we could use on our smartphone and send to anyone we wanted, anytime in the day, any amount, cheap, and almost instantaneous. That's what they say. And what's more, they would do away with volatility. They would bring stability to cryptocurrencies. That's what they say. But here comes the fine print. Anti-money laundering and terrorist financing controls would nevertheless run in the background. If a suspicion arose, it would be possible to lift the veil of anonymity and investigate. You all know what this means. This is backdoor. This is backdoor for cryptocurrencies. And we all know where this leads. We've seen it play out in the 90s with the Clipper chip battle, and more recently after the Edward Snowden revelations where the US government and the National Security Agency wanted Apple and Google and other platforms to have a backdoor in their encryptions. So we all know where this leads. So when I think of the future of money, I see mostly two scenarios. We can have either free, decentralized, global, open, uncensorable money, like Bitcoin, or we can have centralized, closed, politicized, monitored, controlled, and backdoor money like central bank digital currencies, CBDC, which is the Clipper chip of cryptocurrencies. So my message then to all these proponents of central bank digital currencies, and to paraphrase the champions of the 1990s battle against the Clipper chip, is this. Excuse us if we don't wish you luck. So sink Clipper and sink central bank digital currencies. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. So, we have time for questions. I think you already wrote a book about this, right?
I did.
In Spanish also available, or so Portuguese?
There is one voluntary translation made in Spanish.
Okay, great.
But it was in Portuguese, the original one.
Okay, cool, great. So if you want to know more about this topic, read his book. But now we can ask him questions. We have mics. Who is asking? Yeah, more light in the room, that helps. All questions answered, yeah? Okay, Rodrigo.
Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. You know, I'm a big fan of your lectures and presentation. If you can explain a little bit more, how do you see the bank system now partnering with cryptocurrency projects for the future? And do you see there'll be first a war against banks with each other to see who takes this business first, because it is a business that it keeps growing?
Well, it depends on the jurisdiction, as I think we are all aware. In Brazil, for instance, right now it's a difficult situation. I mean, it's mainly because of what I mentioned there, anti-money laundering laws and all these fraud prevention mechanisms and rules that they impose. It's right now a difficult moment for cryptocurrency projects, either exchanges or other companies, to have access to banking. And as of now, I think it's more related to, at a lower level, let's say a managerial level. It's not a, some people think it's a conspiracy theory of the bankers. I don't think it's there yet. It might come to this position, but it's not there yet. But people don't understand it very well. When you talk to an official at a bank's branch, I mean, the guy doesn't understand almost anything. What he knows is what he reads in the press, and what the press prints is always bullshit. I mean, it's always bad press. It's always about someone lost their private key, or an exchange was hacked, or was used in the black market. And when this guy has the pen to sign if he either approves or disapproves of a new account for a cryptocurrency business, he'll just decide on his own best interest, I don't want to run this risk, so let's just deny this access to the banking system. So we need more, even more education, more clarification, but so we can have a more open financial system to cryptocurrencies.
Okay. One more question, the lady. Do you have a microphone for the lady? Where's the... No? Okay.
Yeah.
And do you see anybody doing that anytime soon? Did you all hear me? It was cryptocurrency and hard currency reserves for central banks.
So if central banks will adopt Bitcoin as a reserve asset anytime soon, and how this will play out with adoption, mainstream adoption in society as a whole. Well, that's a very good question. I don't think right now, we wouldn't see, I don't think in the couple of years, perhaps even 5 or 10 years, any central bank adopting Bitcoin as a safe haven asset. But the more these imbalances grow, the more people realize, the governments realize around the world that the current financial system is unsustainable. And it's difficult to time when this will all crash, but inevitably it will. It's hard to tell when this will happen. But the more these imbalances grow, the more Bitcoin will be viewed as one alternative. And the more the other measures like prohibiting cash, I mean, this is a arbitrary and an authoritarian measure, and it will, I think, somehow, sometime be enforced in a country. We have this test being done. And when we see that what is ironic, the last vestige of freedom in the current monetary order is the paper currency itself, which is an irredeemable paper issued by the central bank, which is ironic. But when this is also removed, the only alternative left is cryptocurrency. That's the only one. So the more these imbalances grow, the more the arbitrariness grow in the financial system, the more Bitcoin will shine as the only alternative. And perhaps in the future, central banks will even see this as a reserve asset. And they might adopt it in the future. But when this happens, this would be perhaps one of the greatest legitimacy measures for Bitcoin. So it will mean, well, Bitcoin is actually money, as gold was in the past. And gold was not created by the state, it was just privately produced money. So this, I see that can also happen with Bitcoin.
One more question, and now we have a mic. Yeah, Hugo.
Hello, Hugo.
Hey, Fernando, how are you?
Very good.
We all know about the war in cash. I work with an industry that works mainly in cash, which is the remittances. And we've been trying to work cash to crypto, crypto to cash, in order to bypass the banks and the system. Any ideas that you can bring on this?
How we can bypass the system with
No,
cash
no,
and
no,
crypto?
no. How can? No. How do you see it as a concept?
Oh.
Because it's a logical thing, but it's rather new. You know, this because of the war in cash, because the banks have been closing down and trying to throw us into the black market. That cash, crypto cash partnership, let's say.
I think there's a huge opportunity, but as a niche market right now, because the big ones, the big players like Money Union, MoneyGram, and Western Union, they can be easily coerced by bureaucrats and governments around the world to not let this technology be used for that. So it can be used as a niche market through applications, smartphone. I think in this way it can play a huge role. But again, as a niche market, not as a mainstream, not as of now a mainstream concept.
But I have a question. When do you think central banks will start using Bitcoin in the reserves?
I have no idea, but not before 5 to 10 years to even be thought about this possibility.
Okay. Thank you so much. Time is up. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you very much.